Welcome to Live Your Life with Purpose podcast. I'm Scott Weiss, and I'm really excited today to have Bruce Deckert with me, who is the editor-in-chief and publisher of Today Magazine. And so, Bruce, welcome.
Scott, thank you so much. I really appreciate the invite. I've appreciated our conversations that we've had along the way as fellow members of the Simsbury Chamber of Commerce, and just glad to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, we've really had some great conversations, and why I wanted to bring you on, Bruce, is because you certainly have. Whenever anybody talks to you, you have a passion for journalism. You have a passion for the Farmington Valley, and it's been a really interesting story that I've gotten to uncover as to, just how all of this kind of came about. Just a little bit, obviously, about. You and the things that drive you. So I'm really excited to kind of be able to highlight this and share that story, because I think it's one that folks will be really, really interested in. And I'm really looking forward to it. And so you launched Today Magazine, a little over 3 years ago, right?
I started focusing on Canton, and we were Canton Today Magazine. Then after a few months, we branched out to Avon and Simsbury. And so we were now covering what I was calling the Tri-Town area of the Farmington Valley.
Yeah.
That was in April of 2019. And then earlier in 2020, in July of 2020, we branched out to the entire Farmington Valley. And so now we're covering from Farmington in the south up to Granby in the north. If you go south to north, it's Farmington, Avon and Canton are side by side, then Simsbury, and then Granby. So those are essentially the 5 core towns of the Farmington Valley, and that's our coverage area.
So you've had a lot of training up until this point to kind of get this off the ground, because you've been doing it for a long time, right? Or you've had exposure to it for a long time.
Right. And so one of the aspects of this is that, so I definitely have had the training, but then, so then after 3 years of JRC, was able, learned about this opportunity to be an editor at ESPN, basically moved across town. So I was working in Bristol, then I was in New Britain for about a year, but then, from Bristol Press, just moved across town, so to speak, to, work for a different media outlet, one that has a higher profile than the Bristol Press, but really the same journalism is the same wherever you are. All the principles that you aim for as a journalist, wherever you work, that's what you're aiming for. You're aiming for, good coverage, for integrity, for, for reporting accurately, and for, the whole 9 yards. And so, anyway.
So what was the difference between going from like the paper that you were working on to then ESPN? Like how similarities, differences?
So one of the big differences initially, my main role at ESPN.com was as an editor. And it was in the digital realm, right? So I went from, working at imprint, where we were putting out weekly papers. And when I was at imprint, by the way, imprint published those weekly papers in the Valley. My responsibility was with the Wethersfield, Newington, and Rocky Hill papers. So I didn't have a direct responsibility for the Valley papers, but I was part of that operation, and I lived in the Valley, But to answer your question, one of the big differences was working for the website. There was no longer a print product, So, and at that, in December of '99, ESPN had only, their website was only up and running for about 4 years. It was really still the infancy of the internet in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So that was a big difference. Was, when you're publishing on the internet, have quote unquote the unlimited nature. So, you could publish 1,000 stories a day on the internet, and you don't have to pay for the printing. You don't have to pay for the mailing. It's that is certainly a key difference that today's generation, Scott, you and I remember pre-internet, right?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
But like my son and my daughter, they grew up with it basically, So the millennial generation and forward,
That's all
they,
they turn to
yeah,
is an electronic, medium.
yeah. But even my kids say to me, and I've confirmed this with them because I've mentioned this a number of times to local business owners in a, when I've tried to present the magazine, what we're all about. My son and my daughter have said to me, Dad, I really like a print product. Because they said, I get so tired of looking at my phone and looking at the screen.
100%. And, people even ask me about the journal if I, will have a digital version. And there's some variations of digital versions that I have, but the reality of putting something down on paper and having this tangible thing, well, I don't know if it's ever really going to go away. And especially with what I do, it's so powerful to write something down and see yourself through this process of writing things down and realizing them. Um, that sometimes you can't always get that full value in an electronic form. And so I agree with you. There's still always going to be some version because people like to still pick up a book and read a book. And, yes, there's convenience that comes with electronics and handheld devices, but I think that even now you're starting to see, um, even with a COVID environment, it's people need to get away from electronics. People need to step away. So if you still have a version to be able to get that content, um, I think that you'll find a little bit of a switch at some point. It's never going to go away because again, we need that break for our sanity and to just step away from computers or phones.
Yeah, and that's one of the. I mean, I wonder if you've noticed this in your neighborhood, but you know, ever since the COVID shutdown hit, when everybody was basically, a lot of shelter in place and stay at home as much as you can, I would notice people walking around the neighborhood that prior to that, occasionally you'd see somebody out walking the dog, but
Hmm.
I've seen so many people walking, and there's something like you're saying that's really healthy about. I mean, obviously in the first world, in today's day and age, technology is an important component. I mean,
Oh,
we
it's huge.
rely on it, but to, like you're saying, to be able to step away and to go for
Be
a
able to
walk.
use it to what you need it for. Like I was
Yeah.
even telling my wife, I've turned off all notifications on my phone, so
Hmm.
I only go into my phone when I want to, right? Like, so I don't get a notification of well, phone calls I still do, but like if a text message comes through, if a notification or an alert or something along those lines,
Like
it'll pop up, but the signal isn't there, or you don't hear that ding, because it just allows me to not be distracted, right? If the phone pops up, the immediate thing that anyone does, even if it's in the middle of a conversation, what's the first thing somebody does is they go to their phone and they're still in the conversation, nodding at you, but they're not. They're in their phone. And as somebody on the reverse side, like if I'm in the middle of having a conversation with you, and then all of a sudden now your phone is more important than our conversation, and that's the
yeah,
direct message that you're sending to me, even though you don't realize it. And so
sure.
it's a lot of, yeah, I could talk about electronics. We need them, and it's a vital, like it's amazing what you can do with all of them. But it's also important to kind of manage it for yourself so that it doesn't kind of overrun you.
Yeah. And Scott, if you don't mind, I mentioned my son and his comment about,
Oh
dad,
yeah,
dad, you don't have to say ESPN is a self-proclaimed world leader. It is. I mean, because again, that was a tagline that, as far as I know, ESPN
yeah,
came up with itself.
yeah.
Again, ESPN is certainly a recognized worldwide sports media brand, right? But anyway, I just want to give a quick shout out. In addition to mentioning my son and his comment about ESPN, my son is a medical professional in the Coast Guard, and so this hat is from him. So I just want to give a quick
Ex-
shout
yeah,
out to him.
excellent, excellent. And
Yeah,
thank
we
him
talked
for
about,
all that he does out
yeah,
there.
thank you, and I will do my best to relay that to him. I'm planning to talk to him and my daughter tomorrow. My daughter and my son have a Zoom call scheduled tomorrow night, actually.
Oh,
Um,
that's fun.
yeah, so she's in Pennsylvania, he's in California, so he works at a
Well,
medical.
and so here's a perfect example, right? Like before Zoom, and even though all of this technology was available, but before COVID was here, you know, people really didn't use Zoom or FaceTime all of that much to have a conversation. And if you've got people across the country, then really what better way? It's the next best thing to them, being next to you. At least you get to see folks, and so I
Yeah,
remember it's like, well, why don't we do this more often then?
yeah,
He was
exactly. It is. It's a.
with it, and it's amazing to be able to connect people worldwide on a platform like this that you would never have in general. But it's also just important to be able to close the computer, step away, get outside, get some fresh air, get some sun. Even if it's cold outside, it's super beneficial for you. You spent this time at ESPN, and now you go from this print world to this digital world. And so during that time, are you able to still, when you were in that print world, were you doing a lot of the things that you found passion for, or was it always kind of other stories? And then as you transitioned into ESPN, did you still find that same, passion that you have for journalism that you had in the print media? Is there a difference? What is the difference?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a good question, and I'll do my best to answer it,
Yeah.
hopefully succinctly. So, I one of the things that I left behind and really I essentially left it behind when I moved to the editorial role at the Bristol Press. I, I I've always enjoyed writing, and I've had some success with it, and more importantly, maybe, yeah, I've enjoyed it. It's been something I have had a passion for, if you will. Um, and I've had, it's one of those things, where, I mean, we can be encouraged. I mean, sometimes somebody says something that's critical when you're young, and that discourages you, and maybe you shy away from something when there's no reason to shy away from it, because it's a good thing that, maybe someone criticizes a drawing that you made or something, and hopefully that wasn't, what if that had happened to Rembrandt or something? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, there's these dynamics, these human dynamics that are in play and throughout our lives. But one of the things that I've appreciated is, pretty much from when I was, high school, college, teachers, professors, friends would say to me, "You need to keep writing. You need to keep writing." And so that kind of validated a skill that I've had. It's encouraging, when somebody says, I appreciate what you wrote here," that kind of thing.
That's huge.
Yeah. And so,
Because, just like anything, when you start doing something, you enjoy it, but no one's ever very good at it. It takes time to develop anything. And so that's, as adults, I think that people shy away from doing something different for themselves because taking that first step feels weird, right? It doesn't feel good. It's uncomfortable. Are people going to laugh at us? We should know what we're doing. How are you going to know what you're doing when it's the first time that you've done something?
yeah,
And so it takes time to develop, the things that give us that energy, give us that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so, to circle back to your question a little more, one of the things I left behind when so here's one of the ironic things, perhaps, when I look at kind of my career journey, if you will. Perhaps my favorite job description was at Imprint, that year at Imprint. And one of the reasons was because it was a small shop, right? And so, I was responsible for the page design of it, and I had someone join me with that. And you talk about like maybe not knowing what you're doing when you first try something, and then you get better. Like, I look at the very first Canton Today publication, October
Yeah.
2018, and I compare that to the publication I just put out. I feel like I've developed and grown as a designer, and I want to keep fine-tuning, keep learning, keep growing. But like, it's like, and so,
But that's the thing, right? Like if you just kept the magazine the way that it was, then none of this stuff happens, right? But you say, okay, well, I've done this in the past. I can get this done. I have a passion for it. So let me start. And then you share the information, and they're just like, okay, well, now I like this, but here's what I would tweak for the next one. And then so the next one comes around, and you're just like, okay, well, that was good, but here's what I would tweak for the next one. And it's always a constant evolution. And that's fantastic.
Yeah, yeah. So
And so now getting back, so now you've launched this new magazine. Are you right back kind of where you were when you first started, even though, so you've gotten all of this knowledge, right? You've gotten all of these things that each one of these different aspects, each one of these different positions kind of brought to the table and increased your skill set, but it almost goes all the way back to all of that fun, energizing stuff that you first fell in love with.
yeah, yeah. And so really, yeah, so my role here with Say Magazine, in a sense, it's very much in the same ballpark as when my very first journalism job with Imprint, you
Yeah.
know. So I'm again, small shop. I am, I've been designing the magazine. I've been so at Imprint, I was writing, not all the content, but I was responsible for writing,
Yeah.
simple stories each week.
Yep.
I was responsible to design the paper, and that was, usually like on a Wednesday. Our deadline was a Thursday, so we would be writing maybe earlier in the week, reporting later in the week, reporting, writing a little bit, writing the stories, then putting it together on a Wednesday, and then Thursday was the deadline. And so I was writing, editing, working with the other writers. We had freelancers and so forth, and designing. So those are three components of key components of journalism.
Yeah. Yeah.
I really enjoy each aspect. But what happened was, so now fast forward, that was 96. Okay. Fast forward 25 years. So for the past 3 years,
Yeah.
you know, that's what I've been back to that. And Scott, there's no question, it has been, in terms of career wise, it has really been invigorating. And I think one of the most difficult things for me, and there's so much to this story, you know what I mean, to all of
Yeah.
our
Of
stories,
course.
but it has really been invigorating to be able to write again, because I had essentially, when I moved from Imprint to the Bristol Press, okay,
Yeah.
um, that was basically a pragmatic move, because um, I was a dad, I was a husband, I had a responsibility for my family. And so I, so at that time,
You had to take care of your priorities, and the
yeah,
priorities were your family at that point,
yep,
and giving them the life and doing things for them that you wanted to, and so you have opportunities that allow that,
yeah,
um,
and
and you take
yeah,
them.
exactly. And moving from Imprint, so Imprint was a lower salary level than Bristol Press,
Yeah.
and so I actually, little known fact, not that anyone will care one way or the other, but I interviewed for a reporter's job with the Hartford Courant at
Hmm.
that time, and was offered the role. I ended up going, I forget that it was a town, might have been Enfield, I think it was Enfield. The way the Courant worked it was they had you cover, I hope I'm not going to divulge any current secrets here, but the Hartford Courant, they basically, it was like they tested you. So I covered, it was like a board of ed or a town council meeting, I think it was in Enfield, as I
Yeah.
recall. And I wrote a story, and it was not under my byline, but they wanted to see, like, how are you going to report it? So I covered the meeting. I wrote the story. I worked with the editor. They liked what I wrote. They made a couple changes, and I understood the change, tweaked a couple things, and then they offered me the job. But and that was the job I was more interested in. But it was there was no health insurance,
Mm.
and that was one of the keys. It was no help. It wasn't like a full time. It was full time, but it didn't have the benefits. And so again, I made the pragmatic decision that I felt for my family, it was more important to have the health insurance in place and so forth. So at that time, that was 90, say 97, 98. So my daughter was only a couple of years old. My son was about 5 years old. And I just felt that was the more important consideration. So I went
Yeah.
from Imprint, a higher salary. So at that time, Scott, when I first moved to Simsbury, my wife and I lived, I hope I'm not giving too much information here, but
No,
my
yeah,
my my son was when my son was born, we lived in Winsted. We had a condo in Winsted, Connecticut, which is just
yep.
west of the Farmington Valley. And and then my uh, mother and father-in-law, my wife's parents, ended up moving to Florida almost full time for about 2 years to care for my wife's grandparents, so my
Mhm.
mother-in-law's parents. So they lived in Florida for many years, and they were essentially down there full time for 2 years. So my father-in-law said to my wife, "Do you and Bruce want to house sit for us while we're away?" It worked out great. So we house sat for them. So they weren't charging us
Yeah,
more.
yeah, yeah, which is a
So
perfect
we were,
opportunity.
yeah, so we were able to rent a place in Winsted. We would have sold it, but the market had come down, and so we ended up renting it for a number of years, and we sold it about 10 years, well, a little while after that. But anyway, um, house sat for them for 2 years. That was my first Simsbury residence. I mean, that became our official
Yeah,
residence.
yeah,
When they came back full time um, to live, then we bought a kind of a starter home here in Simsbury, and been here ever since. But
excellent.
and so my daughter was born so we moved in like early July. My daughter was born in late July of '95, and
Mm,
and I started working in imprint the following year in
yeah,
'96. So anyway, just a little personal history there to go with the
yeah, of
career history.
course.
But yeah, so I so yeah, so that decision to move from imprint to the Bristol Press, job description wise, I would have preferred staying at imprint.
Yeah, yeah.
But I moved again. It was a higher salary, and the timing, Scott, it's like you talk about timing. Like it was about the time that my in-laws were moving back to their home. That was when I had this opportunity to move to the Bristol Press.
Yeah.
And so the increase in salary now meant that, like, at the imprint salary, it would have been dicey to
It would have
pay
been
mortgage.
maybe a little tougher to buy a home, all of that
Exactly.
stuff. This allowed you to then say, okay, well, we want to put roots here. We're looking, you got health insurance. And so, yeah, different
Yeah.
priorities happen at different times. But the, the beauty of the story, I think, for me, though, knowing you and then getting some of this is that, you do all of these things and you take care of family, you put your family first, you do all of this. But then it comes down to a time where you're now able to give this back to yourself, like the passion, the drive, because, while this is all energizing, I can't even imagine the struggle and the stress. Well, I can imagine of getting it all done. So while it is energizing and invigorating, all of the challenges and the difficulties that come away are also tremendous, I'm sure.
And yeah, so it's been invigorating and energizing in terms of the opportunity to write again, and so like I said, basically after that year at imprint, I moved to the Bristol Press in an editorial role. Um, had an editorial role when I was the Sunday edition editor for that Herald Press, the joint publication that I mentioned, and then very much an editorial role at ESPN.com for ESPN. We started off as ESPN.com, and then the smartphone revolution happened, and we morphed to become ESPN Digital Media because
Mhm.
now there were a number of different ways to access our content, not just through the PC. So when I first started working in December of '99, ESPN.com, the only way to access the internet was through your personal computer.
Yeah.
And then the smartphones, within 4 or 5 years, they showed up in the scene, and in a way, away we went. But yeah, yeah, definitely invigorating and energizing, and yet no question, like you're saying, nerve wracking. So financially, it's a challenge because I mean, and I had a friend say this to me when I was, working to launch the magazine, that apparently, I don't, there was some statistic that most startup businesses don't turn a profit. It takes like a year or two to turn a
Oh
profit.
yeah, at least 2 to 3 years sometimes for a startup business to
Yeah,
become profitable.
yeah. And I was thinking, like, I hope that's not the case with this magazine because I need to pay the bills and everything. And but really, anybody who starts up a business recognizes that it's a lot of hard work, one. And yes, it's invigorating because when you're doing something that you really care about, that you enjoy. But there are challenges, and finances is one of them. The financial challenge is part of that because it's, I don't know, the get rich quick schemes. I think by and large they don't play out.
No,
Unless you win the lottery.
takes
You know.
all of this, but it takes passion. It takes understanding why you're doing something to be able to continue to fight through and to move through. Correct? I mean, I'm sure you found that for yourself.
Definitely, definitely, and yeah, yeah. I mean, what you're saying really resonates because, I think it kind of speaks to the blend that is life. That is our human experience because we there are aspects of life where there's a lot of joy and there's enjoyment, and there's also real challenge and difficulty, and you
Struggle.
gotta
Life
really.
is hard, right? Like it's hard to
Yeah,
meet what is happening is going to be difficult. And it's just how do we approach it? And if we're approaching it with what we want and what drives us and what gives us passion and gives us purpose and gives us, an understanding of knowing why we're doing something, then it's easier to push through, right? It's easier to say, okay, this is just a moment in time. Things will continue to progress.
yeah. One of the goals I have journalistically is I want Today Magazine to report and to record the underreported upside of the Farmington Valley. And that is a phrase that occurred to me maybe a year or so into the process.
What's an example of that? Like, do you have an example of like how a story that one of the first stories that you launched, or how does that come into reality for you?
Yeah. So well, let's see. In other words, let me, if I can, maybe I'll give you a little bit big picture, and then I'll try to come to a specific example.
Perfect.
I think one of the fair critiques of the media in general is, and especially if you're watching the TV news a lot or maybe listen to the radio news, is people I think have this fair critique of why so much negative, why so much downside,
Mm.
and it does seem that I'll listen to the radio news often enough. I don't watch the TV news hardly at all, but and being a monthly magazine, I don't need to stay glued to what's happening day to day because
Yeah.
I love the monthly format because we can deal more with human interest and get into more, people-oriented stories that
Hmm.
aren't, well, they're not dependent on, did the stock market go up 10 points or down 20 points today, or whatever the case may
Yeah.
be. So, anyway, but I think that's a fair critique of the media, because again, when I listen to the radio news, it seems like the top and bottom of every hour, they lead with an assault or a homicide or a scandal, and
Hmm.
or the latest COVID statistics, and for instance, I've heard recently, I've thought about reaching out to this media outlet, but I'm not going to mention it, but I hear this COVID reporting of, and today, there were, 50 more COVID deaths. Well, I think that's incomplete reporting because I think you need to. So again, my son's a medical professional in the Coast Guard. Like the COVID impact on their Coast Guard base has been minimal. They've had people contract, COVID-19, but often mild symptoms, asymptomatic. You hear stories of younger, and because it's a younger group. Last time I heard, like the CDC on its own website, they, the above 60, 70, 80, that age group, yes, it's like a 20% or more mortality rate. That's a significant number. And
Yeah.
so that's the group we need to be caring about, and they need to be especially cautious. But if you look at the mortality rate of COVID for like 0 to 18, 18 to 29, last time I checked, it was like less than 1%.
Mm.
And so what I'm getting at is like to say, across the country, I don't know, let's pull it a number.
Yeah.
10,000 people died of COVID today.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think a better reporting would be to say 10,000 people died, and this is how many people in this age group. This is how many people. Now they don't have the time for that, maybe, but in other words, I don't know. So that COVID
Well,
report,
because it's kind of highlighting a story because they need, it's like, what do people want to hear? And so when you figure, and you can report on all of these different numbers, it's their way of like capturing your attention, right? But it doesn't give the full picture because they're only reporting on one specific number of a variety of different numbers that are out there, right?
right, right, yeah, 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 and so that's just one aspect of, again, and I've seen, I remember early in the COVID shutdown, I saw on YouTube there was a media outlet that had a coverage of somebody who had gotten COVID and they got better and they were discharged, and they showed like the person being escort, taken, they were leaving the hospital, and like the staff of the hospital was like
Yeah,
cheering, and so I mean,
clapping.
so again, it's not, it for someone to say like, oh, the media is always negative. That's not true. That's not accurate. But I think that there is this sense of, oh man, the TV news. It's like somebody else got killed and somebody else.
It's all
The,
negative. So maybe so
and
basically reporting on the happier things, reporting on the more
reporting on the good
positive
stuff. Reporting
thing,
on
the good things that people are doing, helping other people, giving back to communities, that type of a thing. Is that?
exactly.
I love
And
it.
so that is one of the goals I have with this magazine, is to report on. There are so many unreported, underreported good stories, great stories that need to be
Yeah,
told. They're begging to be told, and I think if most of the media, and again, if that's accurate, if a lot of the media, many of the media outlets are reporting kind of this, oh, there was a crime today. Okay, yeah, that's significant. If when here's what I try to here's how I want to balance it. When something difficult happens in someone's life, that is news. Yes, that's significant. But I think we need to really aim as human beings. We need to try to aim to see the balance, And so, like we were saying a moment ago, Scott, like there's always challenges in life, no
yeah,
question. And at the same time, I believe there's always something to be grateful for. And
one
so
hundred
how
percent.
can we balance that? And I'm not saying it's easy by any means, but so with Today Magazine, I want to be reporting these good stories that go underreported. And also at the same time to report meaningful news. In other words, I don't want to be Pollyannish, because I think,
Yeah,
again, like there's this quote unquote feel good journalism
yeah,
to the point of that we're going to pretend like that's all life is about. No, of course
yeah.
not. But to try to have the balance, and so I
That's
think
great.
Pollyannish is one way to put it, which is Pollyannish carries a tone of like you're
Hmm.
just being like kind of naive.
Looking at life through rose-colored glasses, where
Yeah,
even in bad stories, there's still good things that happen, right?
exactly.
Like, you know
Yeah,
what I mean? And so somebody maybe, got hurt from somebody else, but in the meantime, somebody else came in to help them. And, thank you to that individual who, came in and helped, or whatever might have happened, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Excellent.
So yeah, so for one example of that is we've had a couple of cover stories over the past couple of years relating to World War II.
Hmm.
So we had in June of 2019, we had a cover story. Um, so any World War II, anybody knows some of the history, remembers D-Day. So
Yeah.
D-Day was one of the key moments in World War II. Was June of 1944.
Hmm.
So June of 2019 was the 75th anniversary of D-Day. So
Mm.
we featured several World War II veterans right here in the Valley, still living at the time. One of them is still living. Two have passed since. So we featured three World War II veterans in that cover story, June of 2019. It was the 75th anniversary of D-Day.
Yeah.
So you don't get much more heavy duty a topic than a world war, right? That's heavy duty. That's war. Again, war. That's big news.
Hmm.
We were looking at it from the perspective of these local members, these local World War II heroes, part of that greatest generation who stepped up at this pivotal time in history and and sacrificed for our country, for other people around the world who I think were being, oppressed in the way World War II played out.
Yeah.
And we were looking at it from the perspective of these local people who were part of that greatest generation, and telling some of their story,
Oh,
and
that's
so
great.
and so there was and then we had another cover story. This past August was the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II,
Hmm.
because World War II ended in 45, the summer of 45.
Yep.
And so this past summer was the 75th anniversary of that milestone. So we looked at some other World War II veterans, actually revisited one of the previous ones.
Hmm.
John Benjamin, he's known here in Simsbury in the Valley. He was 102 years old, when 101 or 102 when we featured him in June of 2019. And then he ended up passing away last June at 103 years old. He was a bomber pilot, World War II bomber pilot. He was awarded the highest aerial honor the military gives, the Distinguished Flying Cross.
Wow.
He flew, like, I think it was 40 something combat missions in World War II. He talked about how every time they got back, they were getting shot at, as they were bombing like factories and fuel dumps and things like that in Germany and Czechoslovakia, that Nazi occupied territory and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And they would come back, and he'd say every time they get out and they'd see the holes in their plane because they were getting shot at.
Wow.
Yeah, and
That's
and
wild.
and so he would, he was a member of that greatest generation. And so we featured him when he was still living in June of 2019. Then we had a follow-up story on him in our August story of 2020.
Mm-hmm.
He passed at the end of June of 2020. And his son made a comment of, like, these guys, like his dad, and it was a 10-man crew. His dad was the commanding officer of that 10-man crew, him and the 9 other guys. He said, and they get up every day, and they were willingly going back in that plane. They knew they were going to get shot at, but they were willing to make the sacrifice,
That's a crazy story, but one that almost, I'm sure, gives you just a ton of, like, all of the struggle, all of the fight, to then be able to produce a story like that has to give you a lot of just, satisfaction, a lot of, like, yes, this is exactly what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and just a lot of pride, right? Like, proud that you've taken these steps, because I was talking to somebody else, and I love Steve Harvey, and one of his favorite quotes is, at some point you have to jump off the ledge, right? Like, you have to jump, and there's no safety net, and there's no plan B, and you have to figure it out. And that's exactly what you did, and that's an extremely difficult thing to do. Extremely difficult thing to do, but those moments give you these different points that, right, like, I'm doing this for a reason, and probably that's one of the reasons, I would imagine.
Yeah, no, yeah. And really, and when you talk about, like, jumping off the ledge, I mean, there's something powerful about that metaphor, because I think when it comes to, again, our human experience, I wonder if almost every decision in life is a risk reward decision, but certainly many decisions are a risk reward. You don't know 100% certain. You have a decision to make. There's a potential risk, there's a potential reward, and yeah, you get to the point, you got to make that decision, and you're making that jump.
But that's where, and that's where for me, journaling helped me keep focused my priorities, because even though we get these feelings, and those feelings, it's fight or flight, right? Like, do we push forward, or do we stop? And whenever we get uncomfortable, we hit those spots. And there was lots of times where you were, I'm sure, and I don't know this, but I can 100% with certainty say that you had a ton and probably still did it to a certain aspect, have those fight or flight feelings.
Oh, sure.
And always had to remind yourself or push through and keep going, right? Because you weren't in danger, but it was this uncomfortable feeling. And whenever we get this uncomfortable feeling, we want to get comfortable. But why? What is being comfortable ever mean, except maybe be a little lazy at times.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, and really, and sometimes the decisions that are kind of foisted on us. In other words, we all have decisions to make, but because we're in a community, a local community, a world community, where every human being is making decisions, and we're affecting each other with our decisions. So the reason, you talk about kind of taking this leap of starting a small business. So in my case, my industry has been journalism, and I made this leap of starting this magazine. I can virtually guarantee I wouldn't have made that decision if it weren't for a decision that was made for me over 5 years ago. And so the backstory there is, I was a full-time employee at ESPN for 16 years, December of '99 to October, well, really to the end of 2015. Anybody who follows ESPN is aware that in recent years, ESPN just had a huge layoff a few months ago. I was part of that, what I think is still the biggest layoff they've had, the most one made. But so in October 2015, at that time, it was ESPN's most significant layoff. ESPN for many years was a cash cow for Disney. So if people who don't know, Disney's the parent company. Disney owns a whole bunch of, big time media outlets, ESPN, ABC. In the time that I was at ESPN, Disney acquired Marvel, the whole Marvel universe. And so then they, you've got a lot of those, the Avengers movies, or that Disney has put out are a result of that acquisition and so forth. But in any event, ESPN for many years was a cash cow for Disney. Then what happened, the technology changes, the things change. And so all these people that had these cable subscriptions with ESPN, now they can access their content because of smartphones and tablets. They can access sports content dozens of different ways, And so people started cutting the cable cord. They weren't paying that ESPN subscription. Now, because ESPN was so popular and so valued by so many sports fans, my understanding is that it had the highest cable subscription fee in the industry, something like $7 per subscriber. Gotcha. Most cable companies, what I heard was maybe $1 or $2. So ESPN at the height, the number I heard was 99 million subscribers, dropped to 88 million. So multiply 11 million times $7, and it might even be per month. So ESPN was a cash cow for many years, but then when people started cutting the cord and accessing their sports content other ways, there was a huge shortfall,
Yeah.
And so again, as smart as
they were never going to get that audience back. And that's the thing, you know what I mean? Like no matter what you do, you're not going to get that audience back.
Yeah. And so, so when I first started working at ESPN.com in '99, our group grew exponentially. And then, then now there's this new trend and people aren't subscribing to cable anymore. So one of the quote unquote time honored ways of meeting a budget is to have a layoff, right? And so it was actually the third, people might not realize this, that in my time at ESPN, that was the third workforce reduction. The first two were smaller, and so they were like ripples. They were significant, obviously, for the people who were impacted. Yeah. But they didn't make big national news, but this one did. And then, so the layoff I was part of, October 2015, they kept us on as full-time employees till the end of 2015. We didn't have to go back to work. So that was a kind of them, I received a severance, all that kind of thing. But that was like about 350, the numbers I remember hearing, it was about 350, me and 350 of my closest friends, were part of that layoff. Was about 4% of the workforce. So it was a significant.
That's huge.
Now most of that group were people like me who were behind the scenes. We were not people on camera. So sometime after that, I think in the next year or two after that, there were two subsequent layoffs that were about, I think, 100 each.
Mm.
And those layoffs were, as I recall, primarily analysts, anchors, people who had an on-air presence.
Yeah.
So those two layoffs may have registered more with the sports viewing public, but they weren't as big as the one I was part of.
Totally. Yeah.
And
100%.
then the one that just happened, I think in November, I don't think that was 300. I'm not sure. But so I think the one I was part of was still the quote unquote the biggest layoff ESPN's ever had. But so Scott, come back around. If I were still working at ESPN,
you would still be working at ESPN.
We wouldn't be having this conversation, right?
Yeah.
And I would not. So my first thought, and stop me if we're running out of time, obviously.
Yeah, no, you're okay. I mean, we'll be wrapping up in a little bit, but we're okay for now. Yeah.
Okay. But so my first thought when that layoff happened was not the next day, I'm going to launch Today Magazine. That was not my first thought. My first thought was, I need to find employment because I've got to pay bills, and and so ESPN at that time. So I just had a conversation with someone who was just part of this most recent layoff, who was a colleague. He was an editor at ESPN, the magazine, and the .com people, the digital media people, our editors would work in collaboration with ESPN, the magazine, and help them get their magazine out every month. And they would sometimes help us. Now, ESPN, the magazine, doesn't publish a print edition anymore. They stopped a couple of years ago. Yeah. And so I think they still produce it online, which is like a separate component of the digital, there's ESPN.com and there's ESPN, the magazine. Anyway, at that time, I was one of the digital media editors who would work on a monthly basis, usually a couple days a month, to help the magazine get their publication out. Just spoke with one of the gentlemen who was part of that layoff a couple of months ago. And I forget what severance. So Scott, I'm like, again, I'm sending out resumes like crazy. I'm networking. ESPN I think they did a good job with the severance package. They set us up with an outplacement firm.
Yep.
You've talked about how you've done recruiting work and so forth. So they set us up with this outplacement firm that was kind of helping us. Most of us hadn't written resumes in years,
Totally.
So like here's how to present your resume, interviewing skills, networking. So set us up with this outplacement firm. So I availed myself of all of those resources. Very little traction. It was so frustrating. And this former colleague that I just spoke with said he's had the same experience. You would think that, quote unquote, working at the worldwide leader in sports, that would be a good seller on a resume, right? Well, I would occasionally get a nibble, occasionally get a phone interview, occasionally get an interview, but was not getting the traction I was looking for, and was frustrating. And part of it is there's a lot of talented editors out there. There's a lot of people out there. So in any event, I again going through the job search process. Then about a month before my severance, again, and the clock is ticking. I know my severance is coming. About a month or so, maybe month and a half before my severance is going to expire, got a call from a former supervisor. I worked on the copy desk at ESPN.com for my last 10 years there, of the 16 years I was there. He was my supervisor on the copy desk in Bristol. Then he moved to LA. ESPN at one point at that time frame had opened an LA Sports Center desk. So they were now producing a Sports Center in LA in addition to the Bristol Sports Center. It gave them there's the 3-hour time gap. So they were able to cover things a little more that way. So around that time frame, our group, the digital media group, also opened up a copy desk. So now with the time frame, so basically our copy desk was available 21 out of 24 hours a day. If you had like an issue or a question or a story that needed to be vetted or edited, we were there for 21 out of 24 hours. And part of the reason was because they opened up this West Coast desk. Now there's the different time frame, East Coast, West Coast.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's probably maybe more backstory than is necessary. But this former supervisor of mine in Bristol was was at that time the West Coast copy desk supervisor. He calls me. He says, Bruce, I've got this contract role available, 6 months. Are you interested? And I said, well, I'm looking for full time, but yeah, I'm interested because again, it was a stopgap, right? So and he was willing, and I really appreciate. Now, he could have called other people who were part of that layoff, and I'm thankful that he called me. I mean, it worked out well, but in any event, he was willing to wait till my severance expired, so that, like, I guess if I had started right away, I would have had to give up the rest of my severance. So
Oh,
thankfully,
yeah.
he was willing to let me go, take it till the end of my severance in April. I started working for his group in April. That ended up getting renewed twice. So I ended up working for another year and a half, for 18
Oh,
months
good.
on the ESPN.com. Instead of the Bristol desk, I was working remotely pre-COVID,
Yeah.
but I was
Yeah.
working remotely here in Simsbury, and I was working for the West Coast desk. So I was working like 4 o'clock, like 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon till like 1 or 2 in the morning, East Coast time. And out there, so they were wrapping up, I think 1 a.m., like midnight or 1 a.m. West Coast time. So say it was 1 a.m. That was 4 a.m. here. And then we had our first East Coast people show up at 7. So that was the only 3-hour gap where nobody was on the copy desk.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Yeah. So it's kind of cool how it worked out. But anyway, so again, so now, and I'm sorry, I'm probably digressing here.
No, it's all good backstory.
Yeah. So I'm, again, I'm working on the copy desk. I've got this contract gig. I know it's got a time. I know it's going to end, right? And apparently after it got renewed twice, but after 18 months, they had a policy where they had to cut it off. I guess they couldn't go beyond that, maybe without hiring you full time or something like that.
Sure.
So in any event, I know there's an end date for this employment, so I still need full time, right? I'm still sending out resumes like crazy. I'm going to networking groups. I'm never. At one point, my wife said to me, "You're doing everything right, with this job search," and I really appreciated her backup,
Yeah.
her encouragement. But it's like I still wasn't getting the traction, and so believe it or not, So again, originally, when the layoff first happened, I was only sending out resumes for full time, because in my mind, I'm thinking that's what I need, right? I need a full time job. Then I thought, okay, if it's part time, if it's a part time role or a contract, let's expand the net. Maybe that part time becomes full time, right? So the only and I mean, it's frustrating to say this, but the only job offer I got out of that in all those hundreds of resumes I sent out, really hundreds, I'm sure it was dozens and dozens and dozens of resumes, was for a niche publication in Granby called Granby Living Magazine. To this day, I still moonlight for this magazine. I'm their content person. Okay.
Yeah.
Today magazine is more than a full-time job.
Yeah.
Okay. Which you can appreciate managing your own business.
100%.
But I'm still moonlighting for this niche magazine in Granby. And it was working for this magazine, and they only go to like a couple thousand, mail to a couple thousand homes. Our print magazine has been mailed to the entire everybody in the Valley, 40,000 plus, 42,000 plus, homes, businesses. This one, I think, goes to about a little more than 2,000 is the number I most recently heard. But so I was hired by the publisher who established that magazine in 2016, August of 2016, as I recall, was our first issue. He hired me as his content person. Good guy, worked with him, a guy named Tony Serino, and he recently retired. And so I'm continuing to work for another publisher. But he hired me, and it was working for this niche publication in Granby that gave me, it kind of reminded me, it kind of helped me catch a vision for, all right, 20 plus years ago, almost 25 years ago, back in the day, I worked for this in-print newspapers group. There was a dedicated weekly paper for every town in the Valley. Now, at that time, there were only 2 news vehicles covering the Valley: a monthly magazine and there was three: a monthly magazine, and at that time it was a weekly newspaper put out by the same company.
Hmm.
Since then, they've gone to a bi-weekly paper every other week, and then there was a quarterly magazine that covered the Farmington Valley. So we went from so imprint had all covering the whole valley. There were also monthly magazines that covered the valley at that time, a different company. So there were probably 8 or 9 news vehicles that covered the valley. There were only 3. And now I'm working for this Granby publication that covers a very small niche in Granby, but it kind of caught, I thought, you know something? I think there could be a place at the table for bringing community journalism back in a more focused way here in the Farmington Valley.
Yeah.
And so I'm still sending out resumes. I'm working for very part-time. It's like, like maybe 10 hours a month tops. And then I got down to a science where it's less than that now.
Yeah.
But enjoyable. I get a chance to write their cover story, editing. That is the other, again, the invigorating component of today is most of the time I've written the cover story for Today magazine, won a couple of awards. I'd won an award way back with imprint, and it's like, it's so encouraging to think like, okay, I haven't lost it, after.
That's amazing. And that's a fun part of all of that, because you find this, you've always been doing what you love to do, right? Like covering news and reporting and doing all of that different stuff. But this brings you back to the heart of what gives you this passion and purpose and energy.
Yeah. And and so again, like it was a process. Like launching this magazine was a process. Again, even after, like, again, I accepted this part-time role with this Granby magazine. I wasn't thinking at that moment I'm going to launch Today magazine, but then there were other steps along the way and other kind of twists and turns. But I'm still sending out resumes. I'm still sending. But then I got to the point where I thought, I can sit back. I can keep networking. Obviously, the job search process, you have to engage in it. And I believe I did that to the best of my ability.
Yeah.
I didn't, a full-time offer did not come. But I thought, instead of sitting here and waiting for a company to say, oh yeah, come interview with us, maybe we'll hire you, I thought, let me be more proactive. Let me see if I can get this magazine launched and established and see what happens, and again, and I think there's a place at the table for another news vehicle here in the Valley. And so that's how,
And 3 years later, you were right, Bruce. Like that's the, and that's the amazing, part about, all of that is taking something from, concept to, here we are today, 3 years later.
Yeah.
So congratulations on that. That's fantastic. That certainly deserves a nice pat on the back and a celebration for really all of the work that goes into doing what you do, and for the people of the Farmington Valley, which is great.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it's really, I'm saying, I've, like I said, I've lived here in the Valley for 25 years. I lived here in Simsbury. I have learned so much more about this community in the last 3 years that I had no clue about. Like, there was so much tremendous programming put on libraries, historical societies, and so much of it is free. And like, of course, pre-COVID, and hopefully in the next year or so, as the vaccine gets out and everything, we'll be back to more live events. But there was so much great stuff going on here in the Farmington Valley, and I had no clue about it. Again, because I was kind of locked into my own particular.
Yeah.
Like my kids were involved with sports; they also were involved with arts, but a lot of it was sport events, and so you kind of focus on your family and whatnot. But there was so much great stuff here in the Valley, and again, we all face challenges. That's part of life. But there are there are so many good stories and great stories about how people are looking to meet those challenges, and that's what it's just, it really has been gratifying, invigorating to report that stuff. And I want to say one more thing about you talked about the journaling is like, that's a key part of your coaching and the work the work you're doing yourself, the journaling, and then the way you're helping people with the journaling process. Something I want to say is, and it's come to mind a couple times in this conversation, is that um, we're all journalists, okay? I don't think there's any question. And over the years, and the time I've been at ESPN, well, let me going back to the beginning of my career, like right out of college.
Yeah.
I taught a high school and middle school English for several years, um, and really have had a heart for helping young people develop as writers. I really appreciated the English teachers I had and the professors in college. And it's like the situation where you really those teachers who made such a constructive played a constructive role in your life, and you appreciate
Yeah.
it. And sometimes you don't care for a teacher as much, but the teachers who really make a difference, it's like that's what I envisioned. Like I wanted to make that kind of constructive difference in the lives of young people. And so I started out in college. I was an English major. I went through the education program. I also had the journalism track going, where I had a journalism internship and worked for the school paper. And so it is one of those things. Looking back, it does make sense. Like my career path makes sense. So I guess that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I started out in teaching, and then I also did PR work. I worked here for a private school in Simsbury, the master's school, for 5 years. So I was their PR person. And then because that was a small school, I wore, the hat of doing some teaching as well. But anyway, I really, so in the time I've worked in the media in the past 5 years, I've given a number, masters. In fact, when my son and daughter were students there, at some other schools in the area, I've given some like journalism writing workshops.
Yeah.
Looking to give back. And I appreciated when somebody came and visited like my class, and talked about their career, that kind of thing. So I've done it. And one of the things I want to communicate to students is, listen, we're all journalists, so I'll ask them, how many of you have a Facebook page or an Instagram page, or Instagram wasn't even around probably 15 years ago, but Facebook was, and of course they all do, yeah, we all do. You're a journalist, we're recording, we're sharing news. That's all journalism is, and so I'm quote unquote one of the experts. However, I'm not an expert anymore. I've learned a lot, and I think I have a lot to share. I can, whatever. But I think the same is true. Like, and this is a big picture philosophical question, but that's also practical. Like, I think we're all scientists, we're all philosophers, we're all historians, we're all, I mean, now it's virtually impossible for any one person to pursue that discipline as a full-time role, right? But I think we're all like, all the disciplines are interrelated, and one of the fun things, one of the enjoyable things about being a journalist is you get to kind of learn about all these different aspects of life, the different stories people have, and then help tell those stories. But you learn so much along the way. And so anyway, so I just think it's so much interrelated. Like when I was in college, I think I thought of English, like, of course I'm an English major. English is more important than math or science, but that's bull. That's not true. It's all important, and it's all related. And so I've slowly over time seen that. So I think, Scott, we're all journalists, and and it's part of life. It's being able to share our stories with each other. And then go back to kindergarten. Like, what was one of the things? It's like show and tell.
Show and tell. We're always telling stories. We're always sharing information, and so yeah, 100%.
So anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this, and it's
yeah. And before we wrap up, I want to just talk a little bit about just a little bit about where Today Magazine is going. So you've done an amazing job, and where do you see the future for Today Magazine? What are you still excited about that is that you're exploring?
I definitely am excited about, I've got such a long list of potential cover stories, and
great.
I generate this list because we have the monthly magazine, and then we have the digital, or excuse me, the monthly magazine has been print and digital, and there's a backstory. Start 2021, we've gone exclusively digital. There's a backstory there, but the online Today Magazine Online is, of course, the internet focused which has the unlimited capacity, quote unquote, of the internet.
Mhm.
But in terms of looking down the road, I mean, there are so many. One of the challenges is to decide, like, what are we going to cover next month? Because there's like, I have probably a list of at least 24 or more potential cover stories, and because it's a monthly mag, I love the monthly format because you can delve in more deep. A daily journalist isn't going to have the time.
The time to put all of that research
Yeah,
in.
but I love the monthly format for that reason, because you can take more time with the story, you can go a little deeper, you can research more. But the drawback is you only have 12 a year. And so
Yeah.
there's so many great stories and meaningful stories and powerful stories to cover. So like, for example, like April, I'm looking at the plan right now. March is pretty much in place, and I'm going to the March cover it looks like it's going to be. Well, I'm gonna keep that. I'll keep that.
Yeah. No, of
But
course.
the April cover, I'm looking at another World War II theme, and because I have several, because as I've researched, as I spoke with local veterans, then I had people call me
You
like,
get more information. You get
oh
more.
yeah, like did you know, like my husband was a veteran, and like we published in that original. The original story in June of 2019, the 75th anniversary of D-Day, I listed all the veterans I was aware of that were living World War II veterans. I thought there maybe would be a couple living World War II veterans at that time. I came up with a list of a dozen.
Oh
And
wow.
then I had people call me and say, oh, you missed this person and this person. And so, like, wow, I'm sorry, I wasn't aware, but then I want to. So I learned about all these other stories from, again, that, the Tom Brokaw, I think, came up with that phrase, the
Oh
greatest
yeah.
generation.
Yeah. That was
I mean,
his.
I think that's an apt, again, every generation has its greatness and its, ups and downs and all that. But that generation to step up at that time. So I've learned. So anyway, the plan, the tentative plan, but I'm hoping it plays out, is that we have another World War II cover in April. And there isn't like a dramatic anniversary for April of 41. So April of
Yeah.
41 is when that was. Now think about this. April of 41, the United States was not in the war yet, because it was December of 41 is when Pearl Harbor occurred, when they attacked on Pearl Harbor, and that's when we entered the war. But April of 41, I looked it up recently. There were several milestones in the World War One, and the reason I'm looking at April is because one of the I had someone call me after, and it was kind of one of these serendipity things. A lady, local resident, called me in March of, I think it was March of 2020. And she said, and so here was her voicemail. I just listened to it the other day because I was going through some old voicemail, and I was reminded of this. And this is what brought this back, kind of the serendipity of how this plays out.
Yeah.
But her voicemail was like, I was looking through some old periodicals, and she came across the periodical of the June 2019. So this was maybe, it might have been not quite a year later. Maybe it was 8 months later. But she said, she says in their voicemail, my husband is a World War II veteran. And so he was still living at the time. He passed away. So he was born in April, and he passed away in April. Okay. And so I'm thinking, I wonder if there's how can I incorporate? So I haven't had the opportunity to help tell his story yet. But that's what I'm thinking, is that so to help to tell some of his story from his, when his wife called, he was still living, and then I think it was March of 2020. So this would have been almost a full year after. So yeah, because June of 2019. So what's that, about 9 months, right? March, April, May, June. So about 9 months later, she calls and says, "I'm looking through these old magazines. I came across yours. Did you realize my husband? He was not listed on your list. He was a veteran of that greatest generation."
Yeah.
And Scott, that story's been on my radar for almost a year now. but because there was so much else to cover, but I'm hoping so
Would be a nice way to kind of bring all that together.
yeah, so the April, and that's when I researched just the other day, a lot of the World War II history, and there are some key dates in April that will tie in with that. So that's
yeah.
so that's a longer answer. So what kind of keeps me going? What are plans? So there were so many great cover stories to cover. I think there's a lot that I can do. I think I'm looking to expand Today Magazine online. That coverage. There's more we can do there. And there's more to that backstory, but
Oh no, of course, but it's it's nice that here you are 3 years later, and again, it's even more, and almost you get just as excited, I'm sure, now thinking about some of these stories and what you're doing than even when it first started. So all of the excitement, all of the energy is still there, and it's here because you can it's got that feeling for you, right? Like you have that inside that everything feels good, and now it's just like, okay, well, where else can I take this?
Yeah.
And who knows? And you provide an opportunity for lots of people, I'm sure, to produce content for you, and you give individuals and people and businesses an opportunity to reach more people, and really in a nice way of highlighting some things that people need to remember, and some people need to not forget. And so it really is great work. I've always enjoyed our conversations, Bruce. We've had some great ones, and I know we first met at the Simsbury Chamber, and had a coffee back when we could still have a coffee,
Right.
shortly after we met. And so I've always, appreciated your story, and certainly your dedication for getting this off the ground, and continuing to give, folks just really positive information, and really some positive things to look at. So thank you for all of that.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that, and likewise. Yeah, I remember appreciating hearing your story about how you started, how you started K Journal, and
Yeah.
story with your mom, and I'm sure you maybe have shared that in other podcasts, but that's a powerful story. And so yeah, so I really appreciate the opportunity to talk, and the challenges are always going to be there, but it is kind of nice to kind of take a breather and talk about where we've come, and how we've grown, and hopefully how we can keep moving
Well,
forward.
that's it, and that's hopefully this is a forum that for me is exciting, because it allows for people to see that, hey, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, right? Like it took a leap of faith for you to kind of get to this point and do what you're doing, and we all have that in us, and it's nice to be able to hear other people doing that and making a success out of it, and defining success for themselves versus what other people may define success, right? And so so again, I wish you all the continued success. It's a great magazine, it's a great online presence, and so if people haven't picked up Today Magazine or logged on to Today Magazine, I highly encourage anyone to take a peek. And again, even though it's focused in the Farmington Valley, regardless of where you are, you're still going to be able to hear some great stories and some highlights of great information of what people are doing. So
yeah, and Scott, if I can just mention real quick, I appreciate the mention. So it probably makes sense to let people know, if you want to find us online, it's www.todaypublishing.net. So Today Publishing is the name of the overall media outlet. So it's Today Publishing, all run together as one word, .net.
.net.
Not
Perfect.
.com, .net. Yeah. So so you can go there, find our previous digital editions. You can find these cover stories that I'm talking about, World War II. Simsbury just had oh my goodness, talk about a powerful story. Here in Simsbury, we just had the unveiling of a Martin Luther King Jr. In Connecticut memorial.
Oh,
That
wow.
was the students here were the driving force behind bringing a memorial here to town to honor Martin Luther King's time, because little known fact, and you may be aware of this, but Martin Luther King Jr. spent 2 summers when he was in college working here in Connecticut.
I didn't know that.
It was a summer job where he was making money with fellow college students to pay for his college tuition. Talk about a powerful story. That can be for another podcast. but
Absolutely.
But there's we had you can check out our coverage of that and his time here in Simsbury. So yeah, it's www.todaypublishing.net, and you can check out all of our previous editions and our Today Magazine online news.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you so much. Great to talk.
Yeah, great, Bruce. It was nice to talk. Thank you for being on Live Your Life with Purpose podcast, and I look forward to our future conversations.
Sounds good. Thanks again.
All right. Thanks.